Hi everyone, it's Bea. Welcome to my first annual year-end book recap. In today's video, I'm going to go over all of the books I read in 2023, rate them, give you a little synopsis of each, my thoughts on them, and tell you which ones I'd recommend and which ones I wouldn't. This year I only got around to reading 11 books because it ended up being a much crazier and a much busier year than I expected, but that's okay because 11 is still a number I'm very proud of and I can't wait to tell you guys about all of them. Starting with the first book I read this year is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This book falls into the cozy fantasy category, and I specifically chose this one at the beginning of 2023 because without going into too much detail, it was an especially crazy and very stressful time, and I was really hoping that a nice cozy book would help me through it, and I'm sad to say, I really didn't end up enjoying this one as much as I hoped I would. The premise of this book is basically that an orc named Viv has finally decided to retire from her life of battling and adventuring so she can settle down and open up a coffee shop. Much of this book catalogs the process of her building the coffee shop, finding a way to get customers, hiring employees like a baker and another girl who serves as her love interest throughout the book. And as this is a cozy fantasy book, I would say that most of the pages are taken up by long descriptions of the smell of coffee, the process of grinding and brewing it, the baking of different pastries, which are all described as something completely foreign because no one in the universe of the book has ever heard of things like cinnamon rolls or biscotti. Now, like I said before, I really wanted to like this book because I was kind of relying on it to help me through a very tough time at the beginning of the year. Unfortunately though, I think because this book was meant to be like cozy, that it kind of means that pretty much nothing really happens. There's no real excitement or fun, no moments I really laughed or smiled at. The romance is a slow burn type where it's mostly just the insinuation of tension between Viv and her love interest. This book does have excellent reviews though, and I'm sure there are people who are looking for this exact type of book, but for me personally, as someone who likes cozy mystery books, I think that I just need a little bit something more to keep me entertained so I don't lose interest. This book just kind of felt like a chore to read, and I kept hoping something exciting would happen, and it never really did. It was just kind of like this the whole time. There's no real ups and downs. I didn't feel very emotionally connected to any of the characters or even the story itself. I wasn't really invested in it at all because it didn't feel like there was anything to be invested in. I think I'd rate this book like a 3.5. It's cute, it's cozy, it's just not my thing, I think. As for a movie I could compare this to, I think it kind of reminds me of like Dungeons and Dragons Honor Amongst Thieves, but like if there was no fighting or major conflict, really. It just kind of feels like the plot moves really slowly and it feels a little bit too modern for something that's supposed to be a fantasy book. If you change the fact that the main character was an orc and just like made her a human, I honestly don't think that there's enough like fantasy elements to distinguish the coffee shop in this book from like a local coffee shop in the real world. I wish that the coffee itself or the pastries in the book were a little bit more like fantastical or had like unusual or whimsical ingredients, but it's all basically something you could actually buy in the real world, which is kind of, I don't know, it feels very uninspired to me. It feels like there's no whimsy that you would expect out of something that's supposed to be like a fantasy book. It doesn't feel very fantastical, is what I'm trying to say. On to the next book, we have A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon by Sarah Hawley. This is a romance book that I picked purely based on the cover, and I was not disappointed. I actually ended up really liking this one. So the premise of this one is that a witch named Mariel is not particularly good at magic, and while trying to summon some flour for something she's baking in her kitchen, she actually summons a demon instead who cannot leave until she trades her soul to him in exchange for a wish. Since Mariel didn't mean to summon him in the first place, she refuses to give him her soul, so he's basically just stuck by her side until she changes her mind. To explain why this strange man is now following her everywhere, they decide to pretend to be dating and hijinks ensue, and they eventually fall in love with each other for real. I thought this was a very fun little romance book, and I'd probably rate it like 4.5 stars. I have to deduct points because the spicy parts of this book are just not very well written in my opinion. I just kind of skipped over them after the first time. I was like, ew. And then I just kind of would skip 2 pages because it was all very repetitive and kind of boring. There's nothing real particularly interesting going on, so it didn't feel necessary to read those parts. I think the world building is good, the dialogue is good, the characters are unique and have very definable personalities. I like the actual plot itself. The spicy parts are just really boring though, so there's not like too much spicy content in this book though, so it's really not a big deal if you don't care to read those parts of the book and you just skip over it, because the rest of it is totally worth it. When I wrote a review for this book back in March, I just wrote, it's like if Halloween Town was the setting for an adult romance book, and I think my statement still stands. Out of any movie I could compare this one to, Halloween Town is probably the best fit. The actual setting of the book, the small town that Muriel lives in, and the odd, quirky, and fantastical characters that live within it are very Halloween Town-ish. This is a nice, lighthearted read, and I actually really enjoyed this book so much that I blew through it in like 3 days. So if you're somebody who likes these kinds of romance books, I can almost guarantee there will be at least a few pages that will have you kicking your feet and giggling. Okay, the next book is a non-fiction book. It's called Pink Think by Lynn Perrell. And this is basically a feminist theory book that covers how from the 1940s to the 1970s in America, femininity was basically advertised to girls and women through pinkified products and toys, which is something that still happens today, of course. If you've ever heard of concepts like the pink tax, where products identical to those sold to men are sold at a higher price to women simply because they're pink. Those are very similar concepts. So if you're familiar with one, you probably have heard of the other. I'm personally super interested in learning about things like this, so I did choose to read this for fun, even if it doesn't really sound fun. And if you've ever wondered about things like where the term Susie Homemaker came from, or you're just bothered by the fact that things like play vacuum cleaners are sold as toys for young girls, this book might just be for you. I would give this book probably 4 stars. I honestly learned a lot from reading this, and although it's nonfiction, it's still very interesting, and the author does a good job of keeping things lighthearted, and there are lots of lines that made me laugh. I don't think there's any movie I could really compare this one to, since it's not fiction, but if you do know of one, go ahead and leave it in the comments, maybe like a cool documentary or something. The next book is The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. Now I'm going to preface this by saying that I love Grady Hendrix books, and I love slasher movies, so I might be a little bit biased. This is a horror/thriller book. It's very fast-paced, and it's very reminiscent of 80s slasher movies. It's over the top, it's kind of ridiculous, but it's fun and it's interesting, and it's definitely the kind of book that you don't really want to put down because there's so much tension built up that you just have to find out what happens next. Basically, this book takes the final girls from a bunch of well-known 70s, 80s, and 90s slasher movie franchises and introduces each as a real person who really lived through the tragedies that went on to inspire the major movie franchises that we're all familiar with. This is all well and good until a new slasher appears hell-bent on creating the final girl by killing the girls off one by one. That is, unless the girls can look past their differences and work together to stop the killer before it's too late. The Final Girl Support Group has basically every single slasher movie cliche you can think of rolled into one. So if you like that sort of thing, you'll probably like this book. I definitely did. I'd probably give this book like a 4.5 stars, and as for the movie comparison, it's pretty much a combination of like Scream, Halloween, Black Christmas, Prom Night, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street. And there's probably a few more that I don't even know of. If you like these kinds of movies, you should definitely read this one. You will not be disappointed. The next book I read was My Best Friend's Exorcism, also by Grady Hendrix. This one is also a horror/thriller book, just like the last one. So if the Final Girl Support Group takes every single cliche of slasher films and crams it into one book, My Best Friend's Exorcism does the same thing, but with like exorcism or possession movies. This one is also so 80s it's crazy, which is something I absolutely love. This book follows a group of high school girls. They've all been best friends for years, and one night they decide to stay at a cabin in the woods and take acid. Things are going fine until one of the girls seems to have a weird reaction to the drug and wanders off into the woods. The girls search for her to no avail. When she reappears the next day, something is very different about her. She begins deteriorating rapidly, both physically and mentally, and it becomes apparent that she is possessed and desperately needs help. Her best friend realizes this and tries to help her despite the demon's violent protests. I totally loved this book. It was completely disgusting. There were some pages where I had to put this book down because some of the descriptions were so gross it was making me nauseous. But at the same time, This book is very endearing and funny, and it's like if The Exorcist and Mean Girls had a baby. The teenage girl friendships and conflicts feel very real. The ending made me cry, the dialogue is super funny, and the possession itself does feel very high stakes. I would say that this book is genuinely scary at some points, which isn't something I could say about the Final Girl support group, but that may just be because I'm more afraid of possessions than I am of slasher movies. This book also has a movie adaptation, and although it's not like a one-to-one recreation, the movie is great and super entertaining, but I would recommend reading the book before you watch the movie, obviously, but I would definitely recommend doing both because they're super fun. I'd rate this book like a 4.7 stars. I just really love how fast-paced Grady Hendrix books are, and I love cliche horror movie tropes. I'm a big fan of cheesy horror movies and therefore a big fan of cheesy horror books. Okay, so after I read those last two books, I was getting a little bit burned out on horror books because although I love them, they are totally disgusting, and I was looking for something a little bit lighter. My whole last video about cozy mystery books talks about how I went about discovering the world's best book genre, so after I did find it, every other book I've read this year has been a cozy mystery book, just so you know. The next book I read was In the Company of Witches by Ora Lee Wallace. I recommended this one very highly in my last video, and I still stand behind that. This book was great, and it basically was everything that I wanted it to be. It has a compelling mystery, fun characters, good dialogue, and excellent descriptions of the main character's surroundings. This book does such a good job of describing the bed and breakfast and adorable little town that it takes place in that I could probably draw you a detailed map of it. The premise of this book is that a group of 3 witches, Bryn and her 2 older eccentric aunts, operate a bed and breakfast in a small Gilmore Girls Stars Hollow-esque town. All is well until one of their more particularly demanding guests is found murdered in her room, leaving the witches and the town wondering who done it. Members of the town begin suspecting Bryn's aunt is the murderer, so in order to prove her aunt's innocence and solve the case, she must work together with the murdered woman's ghost to get to the bottom of who killed Constance Graves. This book reminds me so much of the movie Practical Magic, so I can pretty much guarantee that if you liked the movie Practical Magic, you will probably love this book. It's like the perfect combo of like cozy and fantastical, but at the same time the cozy nature of the novel doesn't impede on the actual mystery itself. The main character of the book's husband also recently passed away very unexpectedly, and I think that this book does a good job of handling the topics of grief and loss. There were definitely some parts of this book that made me cry, and I think that says a lot because that means that the characters feel real enough that you can build a connection with them and feel empathy toward them and what they're going through. Overall, I would give this book a perfect 5. If you want a book with cozy fall vibes that's like if Nancy Drew, Gilmore Girls, and Practical Magic had a baby, you should probably read this book. I promise you won't be disappointed. Alright, the next book is A Potion to Die For by Heather Blake. Oh man, this one was just not what I wanted it to be at all. I was super disappointed in this one, I'm not gonna lie. This one takes place in a picturesque little town in the south where everyone knows everyone and which serves as a very popular wedding destination. The main character is a witch and owner of a potion shop in the center of town where she makes all sorts of potions for the residents of the town. Business is going well until one morning she finds a man dead in her shop clutching one of her potion bottles in his hand, and the residents of the town begin believing that she had poisoned him. It's up to her to prove her innocence and solve the case of who actually killed him. I would only give this book like 2.7 stars. And I'll tell you why, because I feel really bad giving books bad ratings like that. Some of you may think that this is like a little bit nitpicky, so I'm just gonna preface this by saying that if you like this book, that's fine. I have nothing against you and your opinions. The mystery itself is decent. It's like a fun little book. It's silly. It's not meant to be taken that seriously, but like, okay, so in this book, our main character is a witch. She uses her magic to help people by making potions for them. Our main character has a cousin who's supposed to be like dark and goth, and she uses her magic for evil by making hexes for people to get revenge on one another. Ooh. And the author basically uses the term voodoo to mean good magic and hoodoo to mean bad magic. This drives me absolutely insane because voodoo and hoodoo aren't like replacement terms for good and bad magic. They're like real culturally significant religious or spiritual practices that real people like actually practice. It feels like the author either didn't know that or just like didn't care and was looking for a way to say this one's a good witch and this one's a bad witch without just coming out and saying it. Not only that, but like one of the major plot devices, and this isn't a spoiler because it's mentioned like right away, is that this necklace that the main character wears protects her from being able to feel other people's emotions, but only when she's actively holding it with her hand. The way that it's described and used in the plot is like so confusing and nonsensical. I don't understand why it was included at all, because it adds nothing, but it's mentioned constantly. It's so strange. In general, this book just doesn't do it for me. It feels like the entire magic system wasn't clearly thought out. It feels messy and all over the place, and it was honestly super hard to finish this book. It took me almost like 2 entire months to get through this one because I found it so frustrating to read. I won't judge anyone if they do like this book, that's fine. And it's fine if you're looking for like a cozy mystery that's just fun and silly, and if something that like a poorly thought out magic system isn't going to bother you, you know, that's fine, go for it. But there are definitely better cozy mysteries with magic themes out there. That's all I'm saying. I just previously mentioned one, you might want to check it out, you know? The next book is When the Crow's Away by Orly Wallace. This is a sequel to In the Company of Witches, and although I didn't like it as much as I liked the first book, it was still really good. The plot of this one is that the ghost of the town's candy maker appears to Bryn, claiming that he's been murdered, but can't remember how. He begs Bryn to investigate, but the closer she gets to solving the murder, the more the ghost begins to get cold feet, as if he's hiding something or trying to protect someone. This book has one of the best plot twists that totally took me by surprise at the end of this book. The whodunit in this book was really, really good. It kept me entertained, and I really enjoyed reading this one. It's one of those books where it really leads you in one direction to try to convince you of one thing while giving you little hints here and there, like to the contrary. I think it's very, very well written, and once again does a really good job of covering topics like grief and loss and the process of moving on after the death of a loved one. There's also a fun little subplot with one of the side characters named Nixie that I really enjoyed. If you read it, you'll get what I'm saying. It's so cute. I'd probably give this one like 4.2 stars because although I think it's a great sequel, I gotta deduct a few points because I think having the ghost of the murdered person involved so much more than it is in the first book kind of lessens the mystery a little bit. For me at least. Still great though, still very practical magic-esque, and I definitely recommend this one. Just make sure you read these in order, otherwise you're gonna be super confused. Next up is Wicked Weaves by Joyce and Jim Levine. This is the first in the Renaissance Fair mystery series, so it takes place, as you could probably guess, at a Renaissance fair. In case you didn't know, I love Renaissance fairs, so that was basically why I picked this one, and I did really, really enjoy it. This book follows a young college professor working on her dissertation by using her summers off of school to study under different craftspeople that live and work at Renaissance Fair Village. A year-round Renaissance fair themed village complete with blacksmiths and jousts and all number of odd, fantastical characters based off of mythical creatures and real Renaissance figures. In this one, our main character is working as an assistant to a basket weaver in the village when the woman's estranged husband shows up dead behind the shop after he had come to talk to her after not having contact for many, many years. Their troubled relationship in the woman's past makes her the prime suspect. It's up to our main character to prove her mentor's innocence and solve the case. The mystery in this one was definitely very surprising. It's not as one note as other cozy mystery books can be, so it definitely gets some points for that. This book usually gets pretty bad reviews from people who find the idea of a year-round Renaissance fair to be completely ridiculous. And I personally think those people must be awfully boring to find issue with this concept, because if it took place at like a normal Renaissance fair that's only open on weekends, where at the end of the day all of the character actors just like went home, the mystery itself as it happens would never work. And also, a year-round Renaissance fair sounds awesome, and I would totally go and I would love it, so those people are just boring and haters. I'd probably give this one like 4 stars even, because I gotta deduct some points because I really hate the main character. She gets on my nerves and I just really don't care about the romance subplot at all. And other than that, I think this is a very fun little cozy mystery for anyone who likes Renaissance fairs. I feel like if you don't like Renaissance fairs, you might think that this is like super weird in comparison to other cozy mysteries, but if you do, this one's probably for you. If I had to compare this to any movie, I'd say it kind of reminds me of like Ella Enchanted. If you like that sort of like silly, modernized modernized medieval fantasy kind of vibe, like Far Far Away from Shrek 2. Do you know what I'm talking about? With like ye old Footlocker. It's very much like that. If you like that, I feel like you'll like this series. The 10th book I read was Fatal Fairies, also by Joyce and Jim Levine. This is the 8th book in the Renaissance Fair mystery series, and just in case you're wondering why I skipped from the first book in the series to the last, I got both of these as birthday presents, and since I already had them, you know, I'm not gonna buy 6 other books before I can get around to reading the last one because I already have them. So I just read it, and honestly it was not that confusing despite not reading the books in the middle. It kind of explains the background of anything you may have missed between the plots of the first book and the last book, so if you read the first one, you know all you need to know to be able to read the last one. But I'm sure the ones in the middle are fine too. This one is much more fantastical than the first, and it includes actual magic. Rather than the main character herself having magic though, there's a fairy godmother involved in a very classic fairy tale inspired way. Basically, our main character wishes that her husband wasn't Renaissance Fair Village's bailiff anymore because his job always keeps him so busy and there are always people turning up dead in the village, and since he's always so involved in the investigations, he doesn't have much time for her. The main character's wish actually comes true thanks to a fairy godmother she didn't know she had, and she's transported to a world where her husband was never bailiff of Renaissance Fair Village at all. Everything in this world is very similar to her own, but different in ways she would have never expected and certainly doesn't like. Her wish had very unintended consequences, and in order to set everything right again and get back to her normal life, she's tasked with making her husband, who is still just a friend in this world, fall in love with her again. And she must also solve the murder of a fairy named Apple Blossom who's been murdered in the village's fountain in broad daylight, and learn her lesson about being grateful for what she has and wishing for things without considering the potential consequences. I'd rate this one like a 4.2 stars. I really liked the fairy tale aspect of this one. I think it was just very fun and lighthearted in comparison to the first book in the series. The mystery in the first book is like a little bit darker than the mystery in this one and includes more sleuthing on the part of the main character and less interaction with the actual police department, which is something I found a little bit boring about the first book in the series. I also like that her husband isn't as involved in solving the actual mystery in this one, because I felt like in the first book she spent an awful lot of time letting her husband take care of everything, which I found very weird. Again, I'd probably compare this one to something like Elle Enchanted, and if you like Renaissance fairs, again, I feel like you'll like this one. The back of the actual book itself compares the book to It's a Wonderful Life. I've never seen It's a Wonderful Life, but if you know what that is, apparently they're very similar. The last book I finished in 2023 was Murder at the Pumpkin Pageant by Darcy Hannah. This might seem like kind of a weird choice because I read this during and after Christmas and it's Halloween themed, but honestly, Christmas is such a ridiculously stressful holiday for me. I could really use like a little escape to a holiday that doesn't expect so much from me, like Halloween. So that's why I was reading a Halloween-themed book in the middle of December, just in case you were wondering. A quick synopsis of this one would be that on Halloween night, while a group of ghost hunters are checking out an old, supposedly haunted lighthouse, they discover the dead body of a woman hung from a tree right outside, which sparks an investigation into her murder with fingers being pointed at just about everyone, including the ghost hunters themselves, and it's up to our main character to solve the case in between working shifts at her lighthouse bakery. This book has a lot of recipes in it. Like the whole back of the book is all recipes. So if you like that sort of thing, and you like baking and you like cooking and you like making cocktails, there are recipes for you. And they're all fall themed and very pumpkin-y. So if you like that, I mean, I guess that's a good incentive because I thought that was pretty cool. If I had to compare this one to a movie, it reminds me of like a Netflix Halloween special. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like a movie that Netflix puts out like once a year for Halloween. It's not like a big budget sort of thing. It's like a Halloween Hallmark movie almost, where it's like just funny enough to be entertaining and like a fun little holiday thing to watch around Halloween time. Not enough where it's like super memorable. Just Halloween-y and festive, but nothing to write home about. I would give this book like a solid 4 stars, like 4 even. It was very serviceable. That sounds like a negative, but it's not. But it was an all around decent book. It's nothing to write home about, nothing that really stood out to me as being wildly different or out of the box in comparison to other cozy mysteries. But if you're looking for like a fun little Halloween themed cozy mystery, or if you just really love dogs, I feel like this one would be one that you want to check out. I'm not much of a dog person, but the main character totally is. So if you like dogs, she talks about them a lot. So I do have to dock some points for this book talking about TikTok so much and using the words goblin core and witch talk so much. Because it was honestly distracting how much I would cringe at hearing those things mentioned in a book like that. It felt like even in a medium that should act as escapism from the all-consuming nature of the internet, like a physical book, I still cannot escape the looming presence of short-form internet content. I do understand that they were probably just, trying to be relatable to a younger audience, or at least mention things that are currently popular or trendy, and that's fine. It's just not my cup of tea, and I had no idea it was gonna be like that until I was already in it for the long haul, so I wasn't just gonna give up. But it was definitely not my favorite words to read in a physical book. It was kind of very weird. Okay guys, that is all of the books I read in 2023. So just to recap, I would pretty much recommend every book on this list besides Legends and Lattes and A Potion to Die For. These are, of course, just based on my personal preferences and opinions, so if you like those books or you just want to check them out anyways, that's totally fine. I'm not going to judge you and your book tastes, or anyone who does like those books. I think that's fine. It's just not my cup of tea. Or coffee, I guess. Everybody has different likes and dislikes when it comes to reading, because it's obviously a very personal thing. I'm not looking to present my case for why you should like or dislike any of these books, but I definitely recommend nearly everything on this list besides those two. It's okay if you like those things. That's totally cool. I don't care at all. Next year, so this year now, I wrote this over a long period of time, so sorry, it's kind of like the end of January. It's been an outrageously crazy couple of months for me. So in 2024, I'm looking to read about 14 books, so you can expect another one of these books talking about whatever I read this year, this time next year. So let me know down in the comments what your opinions are on any of these books, if you've read them, or what your favorite book you read this year was. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe found a book you might be interested in checking out or something, because that would be cool if I inspired you to read something. So as always, thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a good day or night or whatever time it is wherever you are, and I will see you all next time.